All right, that YouGov poll in the Australian today, it's experimental methodology. It's methodology used in the United Kingdom, I beg your pardon. We haven't used it in Australia, so time will see whether it's all it's cracked up to be. It has the opposition, the Labor opposition, winning 80 seats, so winning a majority in its own right. We'll see what my next guest makes of it all. Let's bring him in now. Greg Sheridan, foreign editor of The Australian, who joins me. Greg, if you believe the polls, and it's not just this poll, I mentioned this new YouGov methodology, it's consistent polling, Ipsos, the old Fairfax papers, news poll for your paper, The Australian, consistently saying we're headed for a change of government and a new Prime Minister, which I have to say is one of the most underwhelming candidates I've seen for the top job in decades. This is a hit, though, on the coalition, because I'd argue, as I did in The Australian today in my column, they've lost touch with who they stand for, and they're fighting on two flanks. They've got the TEALs, that's getting all the focus and attention out of these blue ribbon seats. But in order to keep those TEAL seats, or would-be TEAL seats, they're jettisoning the values of conservative Australians, and they'll lose government in the regions and the outer suburbs. Forget the TEALs, that's the problem.
Yeah, look, I think you're dead right, Peter. I think a couple of things about this. First of all, I do think this polling method is likely to be pretty accurate. It's what Dominic Cummings used to suss out the British electorate before the Brexit vote, and it does seem to have the ability to overcome some of the deficiencies of traditional polling. However, many of the individual seats are still line ball, so the government could conceivably pull it out of the fry pan, and in a sense, as Dennis Shanahan was arguing earlier, having a poll saying you're going to lose for sure probably helps you. Everybody wants to be the underdog. But to your broader point about the Liberals losing their core, I think that's absolutely right. They won't stand and fight. They're caught in this identity crisis and they can't work out who they are. Now, the structure of politics on the centre-left is that 10% of the most left-wing voters have gone to the Greens permanently. Labor has lost that forever. But that doesn't really hurt Labor because the Greens are like the old DLP. They're very disciplined in the delivery of their preferences. So that 10%, that comes back to Labor automatically. Now, it's the centre-right has been different from the centre-left in the sense that it's held its coalition together up till this point. But its coalition is as internally incompatible as Labor's coalition. And you'd expect it's going to have to break off probably to a 10%, on the more hardline nationalist right and 30% in the more centre right. But whether the right-wing forces can ever establish a structure as stable as that which Labor has with the Greens, who knows?
Voters on the centre-right, as you know, are generally individual. Some are even libertarian. They're not necessarily, as you say, disciplined on their preferences. We know the Green preferences come to Labor, back to Labor about 80% of the time, very disciplined. Not so on the right. If you look at Newspoll, though, you'll see that there's a grouping of 9%, but split between Palmer and One Nation. And then there's another grouping of other. Let's assume everyone in that group is a TEAL voter. That's 6%. The focus in this election campaign, and I have to say for the last couple of years, in policy terms from the coalition, is all focused on that 6%, but that 6% is driving that 9% to grow and leave the party. Now, Blind Freddie can tell you in terms of numbers, 9% loss is worse than a 6% loss, so they'll lose government because they've jettisoned their base in order to try and get some of these TEAL voters who are left-wing voters. I mean, they've got a more extreme climate demand, these TEAL types, than even the Labor Party.
Well, yeah, I think your analysis is bang on, Peter. So again, let me give you, as foreign editor, let me give you an international example. David Cameron and Theresa May in Britain tried to cleave to the soggy centre in order to hang on to power, and they were always ebbing away from power. Now, Boris Johnson came in, and on Brexit, not on a lot of other things, on a lot of other things he's been very disappointing, but on Brexit and on national security and now on Ukraine, he went back to traditional conservative identity. He went, if you like, hard right. He didn't take an equivocal position on Brexit. He took a position, a strong position, a position that you could, describe, it's an inadequate term, but you could describe it as more right-wing than a centrist position. And he prosecuted the argument, and he won the argument, and he won a huge landslide election victory. One of my criticisms of the Morrison government is that it's tried to neutralise all the big arguments in Australian politics. It hasn't tried to win a single big argument. And a point I know you've been making is that for a decade, Liberals have been winning elections on the climate change argument. Not that they're against action to reduce emissions, but that Labor's actions are too radical and too costly, and the Liberals are going to reduce emissions sensibly, but hang on to energy security and all the rest of it. Well, they haven't prosecuted that case this time. They've simply surrendered. So Morrison the other night in the debate was saying he thought he would get emissions down by 35% by 2030. Labor promises 43%. Well, that's no difference at all, given how ropey all these promises are. So they've given up the fight. But, a coward dies 1,000 times, a brave man only dies once. Would have been much better to go down swinging, I think, than to just ebb out of office as a pale imitation of your opponents.
Well, I tell you what, I spoke to a number of Liberal Party frontbenchers today, and that is pretty much echoing what they have said to me, that they'd rather go down fighting. They don't feel like they're fighting hard enough as it is, but we'll see what happens. The issue of costings. I've worked on election campaigns. Costings are incredibly important. They are the promises that you make as a political party and the demonstration that what you cost a particular policy at stacks up, and that you can then deliver it, and that the overall macro budget numbers are there and it's transparent to the taxpayer. I've never seen an election campaign where the issue of costings is so removed from the debate. Now, the government's just had a budget. Its costings are pretty clear. Labor's under no pressure to put its costings out. Indeed, it said it won't put them out until next week, until after the Liberal Party's launch on Sunday. Do we not care about debt and deficit anymore?
I think that's the sad truth. Apparently we don't. As you know, Peter, I think this has been a very debased campaign on both sides. Honestly, I don't think either of them deserves to be elected. Although I wouldn't advocate voting for a minor party, because that way lies chaos. But how is the Liberal Party having its campaign launch 1 week before, or 6 days before the vote? I mean, the English language, launch means something that you start with. I'm old enough to remember when campaign launches came at the beginning of campaigns. It is true that the government has provided a budget, therefore its costings are there. But honestly, even the budget's figures are so ropey and ridiculous. All these defence dollar amounts the government is promising, they're all off in la-la land, long past the forward estimates. They have no meaning at all. And I think that Labor is certainly guilty of not providing its costings, but I think the whole political culture has become detached from reality. Labor and Liberal alike are both just promising an infinite amount of money for an infinite amount of programs. Everything from dog parks. Look, I've got a $50 million program. I just haven't flagged with the government yet. I'm sure they'll give me the money. They're giving it to everybody else. And I think the whole of the campaign has completely lost touch with fiscal reality. And there's going to be a shocking hangover from this. We're going to wake up one day when a third of our budget is going to go to servicing the debt, and we can't do anything. And we're going to say, well, how did we go from being the richest country in the world to being so savagely in hock? And I think this campaign has not been spiteful or hateful, and it hasn't been completely fantasy like the Philippines presidential campaign, but it's been detached, completely detached from fiscal reality.
And of course, it's not the government's money. I mean, I hear that phrase talked about a lot in the media, the government's spending this and the government's money here. It's our money. It all has to be paid back. And there is a point in time, and I have to keep reminding people that when the cost of money increases, Australia will be paying back as an interest payment, like we both do with our mortgages, Greg. We'll be paying back $15, $20 billion a year. And just like our mortgage interest, that's dead money. That's money we could spend on hospitals and roads and schools. But we've got this debt burden now for the next 30 or 40 years.
Absolutely, and it doesn't get better by itself. It only gets better if you then get the budget into a primary surplus so that your current expenditure is less than your current intakes, and then you've got to pay off some of the interest. So you've got to have a big surplus in order to pay off some of the interest. Now, in the past, governments short-circuited that by privatising assets, but we've privatised most of the assets. There's nothing left to sell. And what you end up then is you're paying interest on your interest on your interest. And we are a naturally rich country because we're a commodity exporter and commodities are expensive. But we're not guaranteed a living. You know, the world doesn't guarantee us a living. We could end up, we're not part of a natural trade bloc. We're not part of the European Union. You know, we're not buttressed. We don't have the reserve currency of the world like the United States does. We could easily go back to our old history of a currency crisis, stagflation. Meanwhile, we've got massive national security demands upon us. The Liberals are as bad about this as the Labor Party. No one is going to go anywhere near reforming boondoggles like the NDIS or the grotesque amounts of money that we've wasted on not improving our education system one scintilla. All of that is... you know, anybody who does raise any of this stuff, like Matt Canavan, they're like the skunk at the party. You know, they're in very bad taste.
Great.
Scott Morrison was telling all the candidates to tell Matt Canavan to pull his head in. How dare he raise reality in a national election campaign?
I've got to leave it here, but I tell you what, this is the most sobering journalistic conversation that's been had in the campaign. This is the stuff we should be having front and centre as Australians go to the polls, so that we have a sense and a better understanding of where the country's likely to head under either Mr Albanese or Mr Morrison. Instead, we're not. We're into gotcha moments and a whole lot of rubbish. Greg Sheridan, thank you as always.